The last thing Claire Whitfield expected to hear at gate 22 of a crowded airport terminal was her husband's voice cracking as he screamed her name in front of 200 strangers, his face pale as chalk, his hands shaking as he clutched a boarding pass that would never be used, because the woman he had chosen over her, the woman carrying his unborn child, had just vanished from his life in a way none of them saw coming. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet strength it takes to rebuild a broken heart, and in the idea that even the deepest wounds can lead to unexpected second chances, we would be so grateful if you pressed like on this video, left a comment sharing your thoughts, shared it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. Our community grows stronger every time someone chooses to believe that people can change, that pain can transform into purpose, and that love, even after betrayal, can still find a way to heal. Now, let me tell you what happened to Claire, and how one ordinary Tuesday morning at an airport became the day her whole life quietly, painfully, and beautifully turned around. Claire Whitfield was 34 years old when her marriage ended, though she wouldn't have called it ending at the time. She would have said it was breaking, slowly, the way a favorite plate cracks first in a hairline you don't notice until the day it splits clean in half in your hands. She had been married to Nathaniel Hargrove for 9 years, and for most of those years, she believed they were building something solid. They had met in their mid-20s at a mutual friend's barbecue in a small town outside Portland, and Claire remembered thinking, with the clarity that only comes in hindsight, that Nathaniel had a laugh that made her feel like she was the only person in the room worth talking to. He was charming in a way that wasn't loud or showy, but steady, warm, the kind of charm that crept up on you until you couldn't imagine your evenings without his voice in them. She fell for him slowly and thoroughly, and when he proposed on a hiking trail overlooking a valley of pine trees, she said yes before he even finished the sentence. For the first several years, their life together was, by any reasonable measure, good. Not perfect, because no marriage is perfect, but good in the ordinary, sustaining way that people rarely appreciate until it's gone. They bought a modest house with a crooked mailbox post that Nathaniel kept promising to fix and never did. Claire worked as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation clinic, helping stroke patients regain their balance and their dignity one careful step at a time, and she loved her work with a quiet, unglamorous devotion. Nathaniel worked in commercial real estate, climbing steadily if unremarkably through the ranks of a mid-sized firm, and though his job required travel, Claire never thought much of it. She trusted him. That was the thing people forget to tell you about trust: it doesn't announce itself as fragile. It just sits there, taken for granted, until the day it isn't. Their struggle to have children became the quiet ache underneath their marriage. Claire had 2 miscarriages in the span of 4 years, and each one left a different kind of scar. The first time, she grieved openly, and Nathaniel held her through nights of crying so hard her ribs hurt in the morning. The second time, something in her closed like a door swinging shut on its own weight, and she grieved more privately, not because Nathaniel wasn't there, but because she didn't know how to keep asking him to carry her sadness without feeling like she was drowning him too. They stopped talking about trying again after that. It wasn't a decision so much as a silence that grew comfortable, the way silences do when neither person wants to be the one to break it and reopen the wound. Looking back, Claire would later understand that this was the season when Nathaniel began to drift, though at the time she read his growing distance as grief, not betrayal. He started staying later at the office. He took more trips for supposed site inspections and client meetings in cities 2 and 3 hours away. When she asked how work was going, his answers grew shorter, vaguer, the kind of answers a person gives when they're protecting something rather than sharing it. Claire noticed, in the way a person notices a change in weather without immediately understanding a storm is coming, but she chalked it up to stress, to the quiet exhaustion of 2 people who had been trying and failing and trying again to become parents, 2 people who had forgotten, somewhere in the trying, how to simply be husband and wife. The woman's name was Isla Bennett, and Claire would not learn that name for another 8 months after the affair began, though by the time she did learn it, the affair had already grown roots deep enough to bear fruit. Isla was 28, a leasing consultant who worked with one of the properties Nathaniel's firm managed 2 hours north, in a city where he claimed to be checking on tenant complaints and structural assessments. She was warm in the particular way that new, uncomplicated things are warm, unburdened by 9 years of shared disappointment, unmarked by miscarriages or mortgage stress or the 4,000 small compromises that make up a long marriage. Claire did not hate her, not really, not even later, because Claire understood something that took her a long time to admit out loud: Isla did not break her marriage. Isla simply walked through a door that Nathaniel had already, quietly, left open. The unraveling began on an unremarkable Thursday afternoon in early spring, when Claire was folding laundry and Nathaniel's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter with a text preview that read, simply, "Can't wait to see you Friday, tell Claire whatever you need to." Claire stood very still for a long moment, staring at the words, feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet in that particular way that precedes a fall you cannot yet see the bottom of. She did not confront him immediately. She was, by nature, a careful person, the kind of person who checked twice before she leapt, and some instinct told her to gather more before she said anything that could not be unsaid. Over the following weeks, she found receipts for a hotel in the city where Isla lived, dated on nights Nathaniel claimed to be staying with his brother. She found a second phone hidden in the lining of his gym bag, an old habit from his college days that he had apparently revived for exactly this purpose. She read messages that spanned nearly a year, messages that used the same tender nicknames he had once used for her, the same jokes, the same rhythms of affection, simply transplanted onto a different name. When Claire finally confronted him, on a Sunday morning while rain traced slow lines down their kitchen window, Nathaniel did not deny it. He sat at the table with his head in his hands and admitted everything in a flat, exhausted voice, as though confession were less an act of remorse and more a release of pressure that had been building for too long. He said the affair had started small, an innocent lunch that turned into a habit, and that somewhere along the way he had convinced himself it didn't count as long as he still came home every night. He said he was sorry, though the sorry sounded more like the sorry of a man caught than a man who understood what he had broken. And then, 3 weeks later, he told her the piece of news that would end any lingering hope Claire had allowed herself to hold on to: Isla was pregnant, and the child was his. The house that had been quiet with grief before became quiet with something colder after that. Nathaniel did not immediately leave, and for a strange, suspended month, they lived in the same rooms like two people occupying different timelines of the same life, Claire sleeping in the guest room, Nathaniel sleeping in the room they had shared for 9 years, both of them moving carefully around each other like survivors picking through wreckage, unsure what was safe to touch. Claire's sister, Meredith, drove down from Seattle the weekend she found out and sat with Claire on the back porch for 6 hours straight, saying very little, just being present in the specific way that only people who have known you your whole life know how to be present. Meredith did not tell Claire what to do. She simply said, at one point, with the particular bluntness of an older sister, "You don't owe him your whole life just because he asked for 9 years of it," and something about the sentence lodged itself in Claire's chest and stayed there. It was Claire's father, a retired high school teacher named Walter, who said something that Claire would return to many times in the months ahead. Walter had been married to Claire's mother for 31 years before she passed, and he was not a man given to speeches. But when Claire called him, crying so hard she could barely form words, he listened without interrupting, and when she finally quieted, he said, "Claire, honey, forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, not a passport you hand somebody so they can come back into your life. You can forgive Nathaniel completely and still never let him through your front door again. Don't confuse the two." Claire did not fully understand what he meant that night, but she wrote it down on a sticky note and pressed it onto her bathroom mirror, where it stayed for the rest of that difficult year. Nathaniel moved out in early June, taking an apartment closer to the northern city where Isla lived, and for a while Claire assumed that was the end of the story, that she would simply grieve the marriage the way she had grieved her pregnancies, privately and on her own schedule, and eventually emerge on the other side changed but intact. She filed for divorce in July, and Nathaniel, to his credit, did not fight her on the terms. He seemed almost relieved to have the decision made for him, as though he had been waiting for someone else to close a door he didn't have the courage to close himself. The divorce was finalized in October, on a gray Tuesday that Claire spent mostly alone, eating soup from a can and watching an old movie she'd seen a dozen times before, taking a strange comfort in its predictability. What Claire did not anticipate was that Nathaniel's new chapter, the one he had traded 9 years of marriage for, would not turn out to be the peaceful, uncomplicated life he seemed to believe he was walking toward. Isla, it turned out, had her own complexities that Nathaniel had not fully reckoned with in the haze of infatuation. She came from a family with a difficult history. Her father had left when she was young, and she carried, understandably, a deep-seated fear of abandonment that expressed itself in ways Nathaniel wasn't prepared for. She needed constant reassurance. She grew anxious when he traveled for work, the same work that had once given him cover for his affair now becoming, ironically, a source of genuine suspicion and conflict in his new relationship. Claire heard some of this secondhand, through mutual acquaintances who couldn't resist sharing gossip, and though part of her felt a small, human flicker of vindication, a larger part of her simply felt tired, the particular exhaustion of a person who has already spent her anger and has nothing left to spend on someone else's unraveling relationship. The pregnancy, which should have been a joyful anchor for Nathaniel and Isla, became instead a pressure point in their relationship almost immediately. Isla, now 6 months along, wanted Nathaniel to marry her before the baby arrived, wanted the legitimacy and security of a wedding ring, wanted proof, tangible and permanent, that she was not simply a phase in a man's life that would end the way his marriage to Claire had ended. Nathaniel, for his part, seemed to want the family without fully wanting the commitment, a pattern Claire recognized with a kind of grim clarity, because it was, in essence, the same pattern that had made him leave lunches with Isla feeling more alive than dinners with his own wife. He liked the newness of things. He liked being wanted without yet being fully known. And now, for the first time, someone was asking him to be fully known, to be steady in the unglamorous, daily way that marriage actually requires, and Claire suspected, though she never said it aloud to anyone but Meredith, that Nathaniel simply did not know how to do that with anyone, not really, not even with her. Claire, meanwhile, was doing the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding. She threw herself into her job at the rehabilitation clinic with a renewed intensity, finding a strange solace in helping other people relearn how to walk after their bodies had failed them, as though there were something instructive in witnessing physical resilience while she cultivated her own emotional version of the same thing. She started seeing a therapist named Dr. Okafor's colleague, a soft-spoken woman named Priya Chandrasekharan. Wait, the naming rule prohibits South Asian names, so Claire's therapist would be given a Western name instead, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Helena Marsh, who helped Claire untangle the difference between grieving a marriage and grieving the version of herself she had built her identity around for 9 years. "You're not just losing Nathaniel," Dr. Marsh told her once, during a session that Claire would remember vividly for years afterward. "You're losing the future you had planned. Let yourself grieve both things separately. They don't heal at the same speed." Claire also began, almost accidentally, to rediscover parts of herself that had gone dormant during her marriage. She had once loved painting, back in college, before life and work and the slow erosion of a difficult marriage had quietly buried the hobby under years of neglect. She bought a set of watercolors on a whim one Saturday afternoon, sitting alone in her small rented apartment, the one she'd moved into after selling the house with the crooked mailbox post, and found herself painting for 3 hours straight without noticing the time passing. It wasn't good art, not by any professional measure, but it was hers, entirely and unapologetically hers, and something about that ownership felt like the first solid ground she had stood on in over a year. Meredith encouraged her to travel, pointing out, with the persistent logic of a younger sibling who has appointed herself chief advisor, that Claire had spent 9 years building her life around someone else's schedule and someone else's ambitions, and that it might do her good to build a schedule around nothing but her own curiosity for a while. Claire resisted the idea for months, telling herself she couldn't afford it, that it wasn't practical, that responsible adults didn't simply take off to see the world because their marriages had ended. But Dr. Marsh gently pushed back on this reasoning during one of their sessions, pointing out that Claire had, in the language of the therapy room, confused caution with punishment, using practicality as a way to withhold joy from herself as though she somehow deserved to suffer longer for a betrayal that hadn't even been hers to cause. That session cracked something open in Claire, and within 2 months she had booked a modest but meaningful trip, 2 weeks visiting her college roommate, Odette, who had moved to a coastal town in the south of France after marrying a vineyard owner there years earlier. The trip to France became, in retrospect, the hinge point of Claire's healing, though nothing dramatic happened there in the way movies might suggest. There was no whirlwind romance, no cinematic moment of a stranger sweeping her off her feet in a cobblestone alley. What happened instead was quieter and, in its own way, more important. Claire remembered how to laugh without checking to see if someone else approved of the joke first. She remembered how to sit in a cafe alone with a book and feel not lonely but simply present. Odette, who had known Claire since they were 19 years old and had watched, from a distance, the slow contraction of Claire's personality over the years of her marriage, told her one evening over a bottle of wine on a terrace overlooking the vineyard, "You used to take up so much more space, Claire. You used to talk with your whole hands. I've missed that version of you." Claire cried a little at that, not from sadness exactly, but from the strange grief of recognizing a version of herself she had lost without noticing the loss. It was in France, during a long walk through a lavender field with Odette's husband's cousin, a quiet, kind man named Julien Ferrand who worked as a restorer of old furniture and spoke English with a careful, deliberate precision that Claire found unexpectedly soothing, that Claire began to understand something important about herself. Julien was not, and would not become, a great romance in Claire's life. Their connection remained friendly, warm but uncomplicated, the kind of gentle almost something that exists between two people who recognize each other's decency without needing to build anything more elaborate on top of it. But their conversation that afternoon, about grief and rebuilding and the strange dignity of starting over in your mid-30s, gave Claire a sentence that she carried home with her like a small stone in her pocket, something to touch when she needed steadying. Julien had said, in his careful English, "A broken thing repaired is not the same as the thing before it broke. But sometimes, if you are patient, it can be something better. Not because the break was good. Because you were brave enough to do the repairing." Claire didn't know, standing in that lavender field, how directly those words would come to matter again, and soon, in a way she could not have anticipated. She returned from France in early spring, almost exactly a year after the day she'd first seen that text message on Nathaniel's phone, and she returned different, not healed entirely, because healing rarely arrives as a single finished state, but sturdier, more herself, capable of holding her own life without needing someone else to co-sign its worth. She began dating occasionally, cautiously, without urgency, treating the process less like a search for a replacement husband and more like an experiment in figuring out what she actually wanted from companionship now that she was choosing from a place of wholeness rather than fear. She reconnected with old friends she'd let drift during her marriage. She took on a mentorship role at the clinic, training newer physical therapists, discovering in herself a talent for teaching that she hadn't known she possessed. Her life, quietly and without fanfare, became full again, not full in the way it had been with Nathaniel, but full in a way that belonged entirely to her. Nathaniel's life, during this same period, was moving in the opposite direction. The baby, a boy named Theodore, was born in November, 7 months after Claire's divorce was finalized, and for a brief window, it seemed as though the arrival of an actual, living child might steady Nathaniel and Isla's relationship the way abstract promises never could. Claire heard, through the same web of mutual acquaintances that had kept her informed all along, that Nathaniel doted on the baby in the early weeks, that he seemed, for the first time in years, genuinely present in a way that surprised even the people who knew him best. But the underlying strain between him and Isla did not disappear simply because a baby had arrived to paper over it. If anything, the exhaustion and vulnerability of new parenthood exposed the cracks more clearly than ever. Isla, sleep-deprived and hormonal and still carrying the old wound of her father's abandonment, became convinced, not without some reason, that Nathaniel's attention was already beginning to wander again, that his long hours at work carried the same suspicious shape they'd had when he was still married to Claire. The specific circumstances that led to the airport, the event that gives this story its title, began on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning in March, nearly 2 years after Claire had first discovered the affair. Nathaniel had arranged to meet a business associate in Denver for what he described to Isla as an urgent, unavoidable meeting regarding a property acquisition, the kind of meeting that could not be rescheduled or handled remotely. Isla, whose trust in Nathaniel had eroded considerably over the preceding months, had grown suspicious enough that she decided, impulsively and perhaps unwisely, to follow him to the airport with baby Theodore in tow, intending to confront him if her suspicions proved correct, or to simply reassure herself if they didn't. She arrived at the departure terminal with the baby strapped to her chest, disheveled from the rush of getting out the door, her nerves frayed in the particular way that comes from months of accumulated doubt finally reaching a boiling point. What Isla found at the gate was not, as it happened, evidence of another affair, which is worth stating plainly because this story is not interested in painting Nathaniel as an irredeemable villain forever repeating the same sin. People are more complicated than a single narrative arc, and Nathaniel, whatever his failures, had not in fact been unfaithful to Isla in the way she feared. What Isla found instead, standing at gate 22 with her heart pounding and her son beginning to fuss against her chest, was Nathaniel in the middle of a furious, whispered argument with his business associate over a deal that had collapsed due to what Nathaniel believed was the associate's mishandling of critical paperwork, a deal that represented not just a professional embarrassment but a financial loss significant enough to jeopardize the modest savings Nathaniel had been counting on to support his new, more expensive life with Isla and their child. The confrontation Isla witnessed was real, but it had nothing to do with romantic betrayal and everything to do with the mounting financial pressure that had been quietly suffocating Nathaniel for months, pressure he had hidden from Isla because he did not want to admit that the life he had built by leaving Claire was, in practical terms, considerably harder to sustain than the one he'd left behind. Isla, arriving mid-argument and not immediately understanding its true nature, misread the tension as confirmation of her worst fears, and in a moment of panic and exhaustion and postpartum overwhelm that she would later, in calmer times, come to regret, she made a decision that would become the true turning point of this story. She did not confront Nathaniel directly. Instead, believing she had finally caught him in some kind of betrayal, and acting from a place of profound emotional depletion rather than clear thinking, she turned and walked quickly away from the gate with Theodore still strapped to her chest, moving through the crowded terminal with the particular blind urgency of a person who simply needs to put distance between herself and a pain she cannot yet name. She did not answer her phone when Nathaniel, realizing she had appeared and then vanished, began calling her in confusion. She did not respond to his increasingly frantic texts. For nearly 90 minutes, as Nathaniel abandoned his business meeting entirely and began searching the sprawling terminal on foot, growing more desperate with every empty gate and unfamiliar face, Isla was, for all practical purposes, gone, along with their infant son, somewhere inside an airport holding tens of thousands of travelers. It was at the height of this frantic search, as Nathaniel burst through the security checkpoint area for the third time, sweat soaking through his shirt, his voice hoarse from calling Isla's name into a crowd of strangers who looked at him with a mixture of concern and wariness, that he saw a face he recognized standing near a coffee kiosk close to gate 14, Claire. Claire Whitfield, his ex-wife, whom he had not seen in person in nearly a year, was standing there in casual travel clothes, a small carry-on bag at her feet, waiting for a flight to visit Meredith in Seattle for her sister's birthday. It was, in the truest sense, a coincidence, the kind of coincidence that feels engineered by fate only in hindsight, when in truth it was simply the ordinary randomness of two people who once shared a life occasionally sharing physical space in the wider world they both still inhabited. Nathaniel, in his panic, did something that surprised even himself. He ran toward Claire, not because he expected her to help him, but because in a moment of pure animal fear, his body moved toward the one person who had, for 9 years, been the person he turned to when something was wrong, an old instinct resurfacing faster than his conscious mind could override it. This is the moment the title of this story refers to, and it is worth slowing down to describe it honestly, because it was neither triumphant nor simple. Nathaniel grabbed Claire's arm, his eyes wild, and the words that came out of him were not measured or reasonable, they were the words of a man in genuine crisis, stripped of all his usual polish. "What the hell did you do?" he screamed, and several nearby travelers turned to stare, because the accusation made no sense on its face, Claire having done nothing at all except stand near a coffee kiosk with her boarding pass in hand. What Nathaniel meant, in his panicked, illogical state, was not an accusation against Claire specifically but a kind of desperate, misdirected question flung at the universe itself, at the tangled mess of consequences that had led him here, to an airport terminal, searching for a partner and a child who had disappeared into a crowd because of choices he had made years earlier and never fully reckoned with. Claire, startled and confused, pulled her arm back and asked him, with a steadiness that surprised her even as she spoke, what on earth he was talking about, and it was only then, in halting, broken sentences, that Nathaniel explained what had happened. Isla was gone, the baby was gone, he didn't know where, he didn't know why, and somewhere in his frantic mind, seeing Claire's calm, familiar face after 90 minutes of chaos had briefly and irrationally short-circuited into blaming her for a crisis she had absolutely nothing to do with. Claire could have walked away. Every reasonable person watching that scene, and there were many watching, would have understood if she had simply told Nathaniel that his marriage and his mistakes were no longer her problem, that she had built a life free of exactly this kind of chaos, and that she owed him nothing, not even the courtesy of her attention. For a brief moment, standing there with her carry-on bag at her feet and her flight boarding in less than an hour, Claire felt the pull of that option clearly, the temptation to simply say, "That's not my problem anymore," and walk toward her gate. But something else moved in her too, something that had nothing to do with Nathaniel specifically and everything to do with the woman Claire had become over the preceding 2 years, a woman who had learned, through her own long process of healing, that compassion did not require forgetting what someone had done to you, and that helping someone in crisis was not the same as taking them back into your life. She thought, in that instant, of her father's words on the phone that terrible night 2 years earlier, "Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, not a passport you hand somebody." She realized, standing there, that she had already forgiven Nathaniel, more thoroughly than she had even recognized until this exact moment, and that forgiveness gave her the freedom to help him now without any confusion about what it meant. There was also, quietly, underneath everything else, the fact that somewhere in this sprawling terminal was an infant, a baby who had done nothing wrong and who was, in this moment, the only truly innocent party in the entire tangled situation. Claire's years of miscarriages, her own unrealized hopes of motherhood, rose up in her not as bitterness but as a fierce, immediate protectiveness toward a child she had never met. She grabbed her bag, told Nathaniel to breathe and start from the beginning, and within a few minutes had a far clearer picture of the situation than Nathaniel's panicked ranting had initially provided. She learned Isla's last known direction, a security guard nearby confirming he'd seen a woman matching that description moving toward the far end of the terminal near the international gates roughly 40 minutes earlier, upset and moving quickly, her baby crying against her chest. Claire, drawing on nothing more than calm logic and a physical therapist's practiced ability to remain steady in emergencies, suggested they split up and check the family restrooms and nursing areas first, reasoning that a mother with an unsettled infant would likely need to stop somewhere private to feed or calm the baby, rather than simply wandering the open terminal indefinitely. It took another 20 minutes of searching before Claire found her, in a quiet nursing lounge tucked near Gate 31, a small room with soft lighting and a rocking chair, where Isla sat with Theodore finally settled and sleeping against her shoulder, her own face wet with tears, her body shaking with the particular exhaustion that comes after adrenaline burns itself out and leaves nothing behind but raw depletion. Claire knocked gently on the open door and, choosing her words with the same careful precision she used when calming frightened patients at the clinic, introduced herself simply as someone who knew Nathaniel and wanted to make sure she and the baby were okay. She did not mention, at first, that she was Nathaniel's ex-wife, sensing correctly that this information, delivered at the wrong moment, might send Isla running again rather than easing her fear. What followed was one of the more unexpected conversations of Claire's life, two women who had every conventional reason to despise each other sitting instead in a quiet nursing lounge, talking softly so as not to wake the sleeping baby between them, Claire gently drawing out of Isla the full story of what had frightened her, the months of growing suspicion, the financial secrecy she'd started to sense in Nathaniel, the old wound of her father's abandonment that made every sign of distance in a partner feel like the beginning of the end. Claire listened without judgment, recognizing in Isla's fear an echo of her own fear from years earlier, the particular terror of loving someone whose full inner life you can no longer fully see or trust. When Isla finally asked, cautiously, how Claire knew Nathaniel, Claire told her plainly and without bitterness that she was his ex-wife, and watched Isla's face go through a complicated sequence of shock, embarrassment, and a kind of bracing readiness for anger that never actually came, because Claire's next words were simply, "I'm not here to relitigate old history. I'm here because there's a baby in this room, and he deserves two parents who can figure out how to talk to each other honestly, whatever happens next between the two of you." It was in this conversation that Isla finally revealed, in a rush of relieved, tearful honesty, what she had actually witnessed at the gate, not evidence of an affair, but Nathaniel in a screaming match with his business partner over a collapsed deal, a scene she had misread through the distorted lens of her own accumulated fear and exhaustion. Claire, hearing this, felt a strange, complicated wave of understanding move through her, because she recognized in Nathaniel's financial secrecy the same instinct that had once led him to hide an affair rather than admit to his own struggles and dissatisfaction directly. Nathaniel, it seemed, had a pattern of hiding difficult truths behind a wall of performed competence, whether the truth was emotional dissatisfaction in his marriage to Claire or financial strain in his life with Isla, and until he learned to break that pattern, Claire suspected, gently and without saying so aloud to Isla in that moment, that he would keep finding new ways to erode the trust of whoever loved him. When Nathaniel finally found them, alerted by a text from Claire giving him the location, he stood in the doorway of the nursing lounge for a long moment, looking utterly wrecked, his earlier fury completely evaporated and replaced with a kind of raw, unguarded relief that Claire had rarely seen on his face even during the best years of their marriage. He did not, this time, scream anything at anyone. He simply sank to his knees beside Isla's chair, put his hand gently on his sleeping son's back, and began, haltingly, to explain everything he had been hiding, the collapsed deal, the mounting debt from trying to maintain two households' worth of expenses on one income after the divorce settlement, the shame that had kept him from telling Isla the truth because he was terrified that admitting financial failure would confirm her deepest fear that he was, in some fundamental way, unreliable. Just as her father had been. It was, Claire thought, watching this unfold from a respectful distance near the door, the first genuinely honest conversation she had ever witnessed Nathaniel have about his own fears, and she felt something close but not quite identical to satisfaction, a recognition that perhaps this crisis, painful and public as it had been, might actually be the thing that finally taught Nathaniel the lesson his affair with Isla had failed to teach him, that hiding your struggles from the people who love you does not protect them, it only postpones and often worsens the reckoning. Claire did not stay for the rest of that conversation. She had her own flight to catch, and more importantly, she understood with total clarity that whatever repair happened between Nathaniel and Isla from this point forward needed to happen without her presence complicating it further. Before she left, she knelt briefly beside Isla's chair, laid a gentle hand on baby Theodore's small back, and said something she meant with her whole heart, "He's a beautiful boy. Whatever you two decide, don't let pride keep either of you from talking honestly. Pride is expensive, and it costs more than either of you can afford right now." Isla, still shaken but calmer, thanked Claire in a voice thick with emotion, and Nathaniel, still kneeling on the floor, looked up at his ex-wife with an expression Claire had genuinely never seen on him before, something that looked almost like awe, as though he were only now, in this strange airport nursing lounge, truly seeing the full measure of the woman he had once had and let go. Claire made her flight with 11 minutes to spare, settling into her window seat with her heart pounding not from anxiety but from the strange, unexpected fullness of what had just happened. She thought, as the plane lifted off the runway and the airport shrank beneath her into a gray sprawl of concrete and light, about how strange it was that the same terminal where Nathaniel had once screamed an irrational accusation at her had also become the place where she finally understood, without any doubt remaining, how completely she had healed. 2 years earlier, a scene like that might have shattered her, might have sent her into a spiral of old grief and anger. Instead, she had felt clear-headed, steady, capable of compassion without confusion, capable of helping without losing herself in the process. She texted Meredith from 30,000 feet, once the plane's Wi-Fi connected, a short message that simply said, "Something wild happened at the airport, I'll tell you everything when I land, but I think I finally feel like myself again," and Meredith's reply, arriving a few minutes later, was simple and perfect, "That's the best birthday present you could have given me. Land safely. I'll have wine ready." In the months that followed, Claire heard, through the same informal network of mutual friends that had kept her updated all along, that Nathaniel and Isla had entered couples counseling, a decision Nathaniel initiated himself for the first time in either of his significant relationships, a small but meaningful sign of the growth that airport crisis had apparently sparked in him. They did not have a fairy tale reconciliation. Their relationship remained genuinely difficult for a long while, burdened by the debt of trust that Nathaniel's pattern of secrecy had accumulated over years, and Claire, hearing updates from a respectful distance, did not romanticize their path forward or pretend that one honest conversation in a nursing lounge had magically repaired everything. But something had shifted. Nathaniel began being transparent with Isla about their finances, even when the news was bad, even when it made him feel exposed and ashamed. He started, according to a friend who ran into him at a hardware store nearly a year later, attending therapy on his own, separate from the couple's sessions, working through what his therapist apparently identified as a long-standing pattern of conflict avoidance that stretched back to his own childhood, a pattern that had quietly sabotaged both his marriage to Claire and his relationship with Isla in nearly identical ways, simply wearing different disguises each time. Claire's own life, in the 2 years following the airport incident, continued to deepen and expand in ways that had nothing to do with Nathaniel at all, which was, in its own quiet way, the truest measure of how completely she had moved forward. She was eventually promoted to lead physical therapist at her clinic, a role that let her design rehabilitation programs for an entire wing of stroke and injury patients, and she found in that responsibility a sense of purpose that felt entirely her own, built from her own hands and her own persistence rather than borrowed from a marriage or a partner's ambitions. She continued painting, eventually selling a small series of watercolor landscapes at a local gallery show, nothing that made her rich or famous, but something that made her feel, each time a stranger stopped to admire one of her pieces, that she had built a version of herself capable of making something beautiful out of a period of her life that had once felt like nothing but destruction. She also, in the 3rd year after her divorce, met someone new, a soft-spoken veterinarian named Graham Ashworth, introduced to her at a mutual friend's dinner party in a moment so unremarkable and free of dramatic tension that Claire would later laugh, telling the story, about how the universe seemed to have decided she'd had quite enough drama already and owed her something gentler. Graham had never been married, having spent his 30s building his veterinary practice and caring for an aging father through a long illness, and he brought to his relationship with Claire a kind of unhurried steadiness that felt, after everything, like coming in from a long storm into a warm, quiet room. He was not perfect, no one is, and their relationship had its own ordinary struggles, disagreements about scheduling and old habits and the particular adjustments required when two independent adults in their late 30s try to build a shared life. But it was built, from its very first conversation, on a foundation of honesty that Claire, having learned the hard way what happens when that foundation is missing, was no longer willing to compromise on for anyone, however charming, however comfortable. Claire and Graham married quietly, 2.5 years after that chaotic afternoon at the airport, in a small ceremony in Meredith's backyard in Seattle, attended by close family and a handful of true friends, including Odette, who flew in from France for the occasion and cried through the entire vow exchange, and Julian, who sent a beautifully restored wooden jewelry box as a wedding gift with a note that simply read, in his careful English, "A repaired life, made into something better. I am so happy for you, Claire." Claire's father, Walter, gave a short, characteristically understated toast at the reception, raising his glass and saying only, "My daughter learned the hardest way possible that forgiveness and reconciliation are two different things, and she taught me, watching her these past few years, that a person can hold both wisdom and warmth at the same time. Graham, you're a lucky man, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give." Claire cried, laughing through her tears, and felt, standing there in Meredith's backyard under a string of warm lights, that she had finally, completely arrived somewhere solid. She thought of Nathaniel only occasionally after that, without bitterness, the way one thinks of a difficult chapter from long ago that shaped you but no longer defines you. She learned, eventually and without seeking the information out, that Nathaniel and Isla had married quietly themselves, roughly a year after the airport incident, in a small courthouse ceremony, and that they were, by most accounts, doing reasonably well, not perfectly, because few marriages are perfect, but honestly, in the specific and difficult way that Nathaniel had apparently finally learned to practice. Theodore was growing into a curious, sturdy toddler, and Claire, seeing a photo of him once on a mutual friend's social media page, felt only warmth, a quiet gladness that the small, innocent life she had helped search for in that airport terminal was growing up in a home that was, whatever its scars, trying honestly to be whole. If you have been moved by Claire's journey, by the way she found the strength to forgive without losing herself, by the way compassion and boundaries can exist together in the same heart, we would love to hear from you. Please take a moment to leave a comment below sharing what this story taught you about forgiveness, about rebuilding your own life after betrayal, or about the surprising ways that grace can show up even for people who have hurt us. Your comments mean so much to our community, and they remind all of us that these stories are not just entertainment, but genuine reminders that healing is possible, that dignity can be rebuilt one honest choice at a time, and that even the most painful chapters of our lives do not have to be the final chapter. Claire Whitfield's story is, in the end, not really a story about Nathaniel's betrayal or Isla's fear or even the chaos of that single afternoon at the airport, though that afternoon gives the story its dramatic shape. It is a story about what happens after the worst day of your life, about the slow, unglamorous, deeply human work of picking yourself back up when you have every reason to stay broken, and about the surprising discovery that forgiveness, real forgiveness, does not require you to forget what happened or to pretend it didn't hurt. It simply requires you, eventually, to stop letting someone else's mistakes write the rest of your story. Claire learned to paint again. She learned to laugh with her whole hands again, as Odette had put it. She learned that helping someone in crisis, even someone who had once caused her tremendous pain, did not mean surrendering the boundaries she had worked so hard to build. And she learned, most importantly, that the family she eventually built, with Graham, with her sister Meredith close by, with her father's steady wisdom always a phone call away, was not a consolation prize for the family she had lost, but something entirely its own, chosen freely and built honestly, brick by brick, on ground that was finally, truly solid beneath her feet. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment below sharing what part of Claire's journey resonated with you the most, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey like this one. Our community believes in second chances, in the quiet power of forgiveness, and in the idea that no matter how painful your beginning, you always have the power to write a different kind of ending. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we hope Claire's story reminds you, as it reminded so many of us, that even after the airport gate closes on one chapter of your life, there is always another flight, another destination, and another chance to land somewhere better than where you started.